I'm Jonathan Bate, Foundation Professor of Environmental Humanities at Arizona State University, and my talk is called We Must Cultivate Our Garden. Someone recently said to me, "What work have you been doing in the environmental humanities in the 20 years since you introduced the idea of eco-poetics into British literary criticism in The Song of the Earth?" Well, the answer to that question was writing biographies of the three great eco-poets in the English literary tradition, John Clare, Ted Hughes, and William Wordsworth. "Why biography?" my interlocutor asked. To which I said that I think that biography is now really one of the few forms in which we can put literary ideas across to a wide public, to speak to a broader audience than that of our colleagues and our students. And part of my purpose in those three biographies was to explore the relationship between the ecological thinking of Clare, Hughes, and Wordsworth and their broader ideas in their lives and their works. The book I'm embarking on now is also going to be an attempt to put some green thinking across to a broad audience. Returning in a more sustained way to the field of environmental humanities and eco-criticism, I'm amazed and delighted to see the range and variety of work that is being done. But it is still the case that a broader public, and indeed policymakers and people who decide on the funding of universities, and perhaps parents who decide on the funding of what subjects their own children are going to major in universities, still don't really know what the environmental humanities is. And it's such a vast and diverse field. Initially, I thought of trying to write a very broad survey. But what I've honed down on is the idea of taking one particular place, one particular space, one particular theme, and writing a global history of it. So I'm in the early stages of a book called The Garden, A Global History, a ludicrously ambitious project. And to summarize it in a 20-minute talk is absurd. So all I'm going to try to do in this talk is introduce two of the ideas that I'm exploring in that book. The first is that the absence of gardens in ancient Greece is a contributory factor to the division between culture and nature that has plagued the Western tradition of thinking, and that is itself one of the major causes of environmental degradation and the birth of the Anthropocene. And the second, stimulated really by the experience of the pandemic, where so many people have taken pleasure in their gardens and in opportunities to go to public gardens during lockdown. The second idea, that the garden becomes especially important at cultural moments of crisis, of emergency. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ancient Greece, and then I'm going to talk about a particular historical moment where garden thinking, garden philosophy became especially important. So many of the ideas of Western culture have been shaped by ancient Greece, Athens in particular, whether it's philosophy, Plato on beauty, truth, and goodness, Aristotle on ethics, or science, Archimedes in his bath, the mathematics of Euclid, or democracy, rhetoric and public debate, organised sport culminating in the Olympic Games, public theatre, theories of tragedy and comedy. So much going back to ancient Greece. What intrigues me in this regard is that the idea of a green space in Greek thought always seems to be in opposition to culture, always seems to be somewhere on the outside. If you think of the small number of gardens in Homer's Odyssey, they're never in a civic space, always in an outdoor space. I'm thinking of the orchard of Alcinous, father of Nausicaa, of Calypso's sacred grove, and of the orchard where, when eventually Odysseus comes home, he finds his father Laertes. The arid climate of Greece and the urban architecture of Athens meant that there were no private gardens in the city. There were sacred groves on the edge of the city, and in public spaces there was the shade from trees. But the idea of a garden seems to have been alien to ancient Greek thought. And you can see that from the way that when the Garden of Eden was translated from Hebrew into Greek in the Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the first books of the Bible, the word that was used for the Garden of Eden was paradisos. That's a word that entered the Greek language in the writings of Xenophon, where he was talking about Persia, talking about the hunting parks of the great Persian king Cyrus. Paradisos, the word used for the Garden of Eden, and that eventually leads to the idea of paradise lost. And indeed, if you think about the way that Islamic tradition arises out of the Abrahamic tradition, the notion of a paradise after death is again associated with a garden. So an Islamic paradise garden is seen as a kind of earthly anticipation of heavenly delights. So what I'm suggesting here is that the absence of domestic and urban gardens in ancient Greece leads to the idea that a green space is a kind of paradise that is either lost, as in the Christian tradition, still to come after death, as in the Islamic tradition, or somehow exotic and outside the city, as in the Greek tradition. And this leads to a division between culture and nature. Within that Greek tradition, culture, civilization are associated with the city, but there is no garden. And that means you get the opposition between a paradisal idea, a natural idea, and a civic and a cultural idea. It seems to me that opposition is one of the causes in intellectual history of the idea that civilization is free to exploit nature, because it's always on the outside. So in a sense, the extractive economy that we know from the history of capitalism, imperialism, although it has to be said that Soviet Russia and indeed modern China are equally extractive in their approach to nature. But the absence of the idea of domestic cultivation leads to that sense of division. A gardener knows that there is always an intersection between culture and nature. A gardener does not want the kind of return to the wilderness that much deep ecological thought and indeed much eco-critical literary thought has aspired to. Now, there is an exception to this rule, and it's the exception that seems to me to prove the rule, and that is in the 4th century of the pre-Christian era, the philosopher Epicurus established a school in a house with a private garden on the outskirts of Athens. And it was there that he developed the Epicurean philosophy, making it available controversially to women and slaves, as well as to men. And the basis of Epicurus' ideas was that we must live in the present. It was Epicurus who really pioneered the atomistic philosophy that says we are born from the earth, born from atoms, we die, we go back into the earth, and there is no such thing as an afterlife. There are no gods looking over us. Furthermore, Epicurus argued that the basis of the good life, the pursuit of happiness, is to be found not in politics, but in finding a sense of inner peace, of restfulness. And the garden is the place where he finds that. Activism is, of course, important. Aristotle would have argued that to be fully human, we must engage in politics, in civic life. But at the same time, the danger of activism is that it can lead to political tyranny and indeed to the exploitation of nature. Epicurus provides an alternative tradition, a pacifist tradition, and one in which he suggests that mental health is reliant on finding the kind of peace that can only be found in a place such as a garden. And of course, there is lots of modern evidence of the mental health benefits of gardening. There was a famous empirical study in which hospital patients recovering from major surgery were divided into two groups, one in a recuperation ward which looked out on a garden, another group where there was no natural light, no natural outlook, and the ones in the green ward, as we might call it, recovered much more quickly than those deprived of green spaces. And again, the pandemic has, I think, shown us that particular value of green spaces. So what I want to suggest in this book is that the Epicurean philosophy is a garden philosophy, and that is of benefit both in terms of mental health, but also in terms of the way that we think about how we live with nature. Because Epicurus knew, because he based his school in a garden, that things that are born will die. There is a natural acceptance of death in Epicurus, an acceptance of mortality and of the limits of the body. That's in sharp contrast to Platonic philosophy that emphasizes the eternal things, such as beauty, truth, and goodness. The Epicurean acceptance of limits seems to me of vital importance and indeed modernity. My second argument is that gardens are of particular importance at times of social transformation and stress. And as an example of this, I want to look at England in the late 17th century. 1642 to 1660, you have a period of great social division. You have a civil war, you have the opposition between royalists and republicans, Catholics and Protestants. So a time of great dissent. It's also a period of considerable growth in urban population in London. At the beginning of the 17th century, London only has a population of 200,000, far less than Paris. By the end of the century, it has 600,000, maybe even more. It's become the largest city in the Western world. Just between about 1650 and 1665, the population rises from 400,000 to about 550,000. And because of a shortage of timber, what most people are burning in order to keep their homes warm and what is being used in the industries that are growing up around London is sea coal, a particularly sulfurous form of coal. It's called sea coal because it's mined near the sea, shipped into London in barges in huge quantities, but it leads to an enormous amount of air pollution, of urban smog. So you've got the problem of urban pollution. Then, 1665, you have the Great Plague. Enormous disruption to social life. Following year, 1666, the Great Fire of London. And then, not so long after that, 1683, the height of the Little Ice Age, period of major disruptive climate change. Famously, 1683 is the year where the Thames freezes over. There are frost fairs on the Thames. So, overpopulation and urban density, air pollution, plague, pandemic, as we now call it, fire, and climate change. Sounds like a familiar picture. How do people deal with those social disruptions? They turn to gardens. In 1661, you have the formation of the so-called New Spring Garden, which later becomes the Vauxhall Pleasure Garden. Essentially the first public garden for all classes. It's also in 1661 that John Evelyn, a writer who's a gardener, who writes a lot about gardens as well as about woodlands, publishes Fumifugium, his treatise on the urban pollution, the inconvenience of the smoky air of London, in which he proposes remedies such as zoning, as we would now call it, and most notably the planting of fragrant flowers, herbs, shrubs, as a way of dealing with air pollution. Most interesting of all, this is a period where the Epicurean philosophy is revived. That revival really begins in France a little earlier with Gassendi, but you get an enormous number of Epicurean texts in England in that later 17th century. Lucretius, the Roman poet, who's so influenced by Epicurus, is translated by a woman, interestingly, and the poetry of Andrew Marvell, the garden poetry of Marvell, is deeply influenced by Epicureanism. But perhaps most interesting of all is Sir William Temple, poet, writer, politician, essayist, thinker, writes his essay on the Gardens of Epicurus, published in 1685. And that is a text I see as a manifesto for both the mental health benefits, the human happiness, and the planetary, the ecological benefits of the Epicurean garden philosophy. So let me end this short talk, this very rapid tour of a large and important topic, with a few quotations from Temple on the Gardens of Epicurus. Temple begins his essay by arguing that the problem with modernity is business or busyness, the desire to accumulate wealth or influence. He idealizes the early ages of humankind. In the first and most simple ages of each country, the conditions and lives of men seem to have been very near of kin with the rest of the creatures. They lived by the hour or by the day and satisfied their appetite with what they could get from the herbs, the fruits, the springs they met with when they were hungry or dry. He then talks about the origins of agriculture, of property, and the idea of accumulating wealth and handing it on to the next generation. From such small beginnings have grown such vast and extravagant designs of poor mortal men. Yet none could ever answer the naked Indian why one man should take pains and run hazards by sea and land all his life, that his children might be safe and lazy all theirs. So Temple advocates instead the principle of taking no care for the morrow, but rather living in the moment. And he looks to the philosophy of Epicurus as an example of that ability to live mindfully in the moment. Rejecting the turmoil of the pursuit of economic growth and political faction, Epicurus spent all his life in his gardens. There he studied, says Temple, there he exercised, there he taught his philosophy. And indeed no other sort of abode seems to contribute so much to both the tranquillity of mind and indolence of body which he made his chief ends. The sweetness of air, the pleasantness of smells, the verdure of plants, the cleanness and lightness of food, the exercises of working or walking, but above all, the exemption from cares and solicitude seem equally to favour and improve both contemplation and health, the enjoyment of sense and imagination, and thereby the quiet and ease both of the body and mind. And then, having written a kind of brief history of the garden, and as well as incorporating practical advice on gardening techniques, choosing the right soil and so forth, Temple argues that the turmoil of the present has been most effectively addressed through a growth in a fashion for gardening. After so much ramble into ancient times and remote places, to return home and consider the present way and humour of our gardening in England, which seems to have grown into such vogue and to have been so mightily improved in 3 or 4 and 20 years of His Majesty's reign, that perhaps few countries are before us, either in the elegance of our gardens or in the number of our plants. Anticipating the argument of Voltaire's Candide that in the face of war, rape, violence, political faction, greed, natural disasters such as the Lisbon earthquake, the best answer to the good life is to cultivate our garden. Il faut cultiver notre jardin. Temple argues just that the garden is the green place that we need as human beings, and if we learn to tend the garden, we will also tend the planet.